So, good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to an episode of Snapshots. In this case, snapshots from the road to German. In this case, we are talking about High German. Here from West Germanic onwards, we are going into another direction than we did in the first Snapshots episode about English. I will go through the same developmental steps again, perhaps a little bit faster. So if you are a new viewer and have not seen the previous episode on English, please see my YouTube account, and there you will find more thorough presentations of the first two slides. And finally, once we are done with the development of Standard German, I will get into a kind of Upper German. That is, here the High German and the Upper German are not they are not supposed to value the name. It is not High German because it is more valuable. It is High German because it is spoken in the mountains. Similarly, as Great Britain is great because it is physically large. Little Britain is Bretagne, the peninsula in northwestern France, which is physically smaller than Great Britain. Good evening, Sinhailos. Let's start with a little bit of trees and maps again. For most viewers, this will be familiar. Germanic is a kind of Indo-European. Other Indo-European languages include most of the languages of Europe and India. That's why they are called Indo-European. Most likely, Germanic is a part of a northwestern branch of Indo-European, as one might deduce from this map that I have drawn. Some groupings within Indo-European are more clear than others. For example, the Italo-Celtic languages, which lead into languages such as Irish Gaelic and Italian, are clearly very closely related to each other. But whether Germanic languages, for example, are more closely related to Italo-Celtic or the Baltic, for example, is questionable. This map displays the interpretation that I favor myself. What distinguishes the Germanic languages from other Indo-European languages is this. This is Grimm's law, named after one of the brothers Grimm that you might be familiar with from the fairy tales. Here, this is a so-called chain law or chain process. Law in this case just means process. It's something that is being described. So the elder brother Grimm noticed that this was the case. He did not invent a rule for someone else to follow. During this process, sounds that were something in Proto-Indo-European turned into something else in Proto-Germanic. And the reason that this is called a chain process is that things that were b turned to b, and things that were previously b turned into p, and things that were previously p turned into f. So you have a march forwards along this kind of line. Consonants that were labial, that is, they are produced with the lips, turned into other labial consonants. The same with alveolar, made with the alveolar ridge, that is the bump behind the teeth and in front of the roof of the mouth. And velar are made with the velum, which is the back part of the roof of the mouth. And then labialized means that there is a secondary articulation. For example, qua here. First you make an unvoiced labial velar stop, so k. And when you release the tension, you use your lips. So this is why it's labialized. You use your lips to produce another consonant as part of the same airflow. So this is qua, such as in aqua in Latin. So we have aspirated voiced stops, Aspirated means that you use the release of the consonant to just breathe out strongly. So b. You have these in English, for example, pin is aspirated, as in a thing that you stick in a pin cushion. All of these symbols that have a superscript mean that there's some kind of a secondary articulation, and in the case of the velar labialized aspirated voiced stop, there are two secondary articulations, which makes this quite difficult to pronounce. So the process of the chain is that aspirated voiced stops lose their aspiration, so g becomes g. This is deaspiration. Voiced stops become voiceless. This is called fortition, so g becomes g. And then there is also fortition and lenition are opposite processes. So you have at the same time some sounds are being fortified, and then others are being weakened, lenitioned, much more than this. So they fortify one step, and then others lenite two steps. I won't go too much into this. Please see my previous episode about vowel reduction. I went into fortition and lenition a little bit in that one. So you go from stops. These are consonants where you have where you actually tension against your mouth and then release it, to fricatives, where you produce a turbulent airflow. So, for example, f. You make this kind of turbulence in your mouth, and you can hold these sounds for a longer time. With stops, you can only release them almost instantaneously. F is something that we are familiar with. Th is also familiar for English speakers. This symbol might not be, but this is the sound that you find in the word the or this. Here the H is also, of course, a familiar symbol. In this case, it would be pronounced velar, so like Buch in modern German. Using a normal H for this is a bit of a convention when it comes to historical languages. Just some of them usually get written in one way and not the other. Another possibility would be to always use the International Phonetic Alphabet, but it just doesn't get done. I have a couple of examples. For example, brother was begrechter in Proto-Indo-European, and it becomes brother in Proto-Germanic. So here you lose the aspiration, and here you lenite into a fricative. Another example, quod means what, and if you are familiar with particularly old-fashioned American dialects of the southern states, you might have heard someone say what. And this is actually the original pronunciation of what. For example, whale is also more old-fashioned than whale. Then, getting into West Germanic. Within the Germanic languages, the first branch to split off was East Germanic, which contains languages such as Gothic. All of these have died out. They no longer exist. What we still have are North and West Germanic languages. North leads to languages such as Swedish, Norwegian, Icelandic, and West into English, Dutch, German, that kind of thing. And we are following the Western branch, of course, as we are moving towards High German. One defining feature for West Germanic is the West Germanic umlaut. If you speak German, you might have heard the word umlaut perhaps being used to refer to the points on top of a vowel. That's not quite correct. The points are there to mark the umlaut, which is a historical process, and technically the points are trema. In this slide, we have the two major phonological processes occurring towards Western Germanic. These are the words mouse and mice. If you wondered why you have several mice and not several mouses, well, this is the answer. And then foot and feet. Originally, there was a simple plural. You had one moose and several mooses. The z, this is a voiced sibilant. So voiced means that if you touch your voice box and make this sound, you will feel your throat moving. The voiced sibilants at the end of words were apparently somewhat difficult to pronounce, even for the early Germanics. For me, it is difficult because we move from an unvoiced into a voiced consonant. This takes some effort to do. So the z disappeared in Western Germanic. In North Germanic, it turned into r. So in early North Germanic, you would have several musir. If you've run into North Germanic, Old Norse, perhaps Viking names, for example, and you wondered why they all seem to have rs at the end of words. Many Old Norse male names have an r, such as Ragnar, for example. That is because of this. There would have originally been an s at the end of it, or a z. Once this happens, you have one moose and several moosi. Here we have another situation where you have to work hard to produce these sounds, because u is very back and low in the mouth, but e is very high and forward in the mouth. So this is the actual umlaut. What happens is that the vowel in the stressed syllable, mu, changes so that it becomes more similar to the vowel in the unstressed syllable, e. So you end up having one moose and several musi. And similarly, you have one thought, but several 30. Then we start getting into actually new material for those who have seen the previous episode on English. Within the West Germanic languages, we have 3 main branches. One of them is Dutch, one is North Sea Germanic. This eventually leads into English. And one is High German. High German. Here the North Sea Germanic is clearly a geographical description. So these languages were spoken along the North Sea. In the case of High German, they were spoken in the mountains in southern Germany. Here we have a bit of a map. So you would have North Sea Germanic languages here in northern Germany and along the North Sea coast, and then early Dutch in southern Netherlands and Flandern, and then getting more and more High German-like as you move to the south. This is the High German consonant shift, another defining process for the High German language or languages. This is what really makes High German distinct from all other Germanic languages. This process is unexpected. Why exactly it happened is not quite clear, but it might actually be a substrate effect. So when Germanic speakers were moving towards the south, this would be after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there were some Latinized, so Romans speaking Roman citizens here in southern Germany, and also some amount of Celtic speakers, as Switzerland and Austria were previously the core area of the Celtic languages, which today only survive in the peripheries of Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and a bit in France. So, I lost my train of thought here. This is something that is particularly strong in the southernmost parts of Germany and seems to have appeared there, possibly as a result of either Rhaeto-Romans or Celtic speakers learning a Germanic language somewhat imperfectly. But for whatever reason it happened, it has been spreading northward. So you have isoglosses, lines on one side of which people say one thing, and on the other side they say the other thing. These processes are numbered roughly in their order. So number 1 happened first, then number 2, then number 3. Out of these, the first, where voiceless stops become fricatives in the same area of the mouth, is something that happened in all High German languages. So this contains both Central German and Upper German. Here we have at the lips, you get P's turning into F's. Again, very similar to the process in Grimm's law. So you get from skip for a ship into skiff. You might notice that skiff is also a word that appears in English. And this is because English has 3 different words for something maritime that all come from the same original word, skip, but have developed in different ways in different languages and have been borrowed into English after the English variant had developed in another way. So the native English for ship is ship. Then you have skiff from High German. Skiff is some kind of a very small boat. But you also have skipper as a person who captains a ship. This one is loaned from Dutch, in which a similar process that has turned skip into ship and schiff has begun in Dutch but has not gone all the way. So in Dutch, a ship is called a schich. Ship. You have a s and then a ch. Schip. If you have flown through Amsterdam, you might have landed at the airport of Schiphol. The schip there is just Dutch for ship. Then, at the alveolar ridge, the voiceless stop becomes again a fricative, but in this case it comes from etan. This becomes to eat in English and turns into essen, which becomes essen in German. At the velum, we have breken, to break, again stays with a K in English and becomes brechen in German. In this case, I've used an X. This is the International Phonetic Alphabet symbol for. In this case, these changes happen when the consonant comes after a stressed nucleus. The nucleus is the center of a syllable. So you might notice that there's always these come after some kind of vowel. They come after the first vowel. For example, in etan, you have the first syllable is only e, but the t comes after a stressed syllable nucleus. So in skip, the p is in the same syllable. In etan, it is in the next syllable, but it is in both cases after a stressed nucleus. This has happened in both Central and Upper German. In the north, so if you had a general example phrase for this is Apfelkuchen backen, so baking apple cakes. The backen is always bachen. No, excuse me, this is I messed it up. Well, let's get back to this after the second one. So then further south, you also have a similar process, but before a syllable nucleus. In the case of apple, the p is after the stressed nucleus, but before another syllable nucleus. So this gets complicated. This is something that has not happened further north. So you have Appel turns into Apfel. So in Central German, you would have Apfelkuchen. In Low German, you would have Apfelkuchen. And in Upper German, you would have Apfelkuchen for apple cake. Then when we are at the alveolar ridge, you can go from tidis to zit, so t, ts. This eventually becomes Zeit in modern German and Tide in modern English. At the velum, you have Kinder, which means child, quite dissimilar in English. And this becomes Kind, so very strongly k, Kind, in southernmost Germany. However, this is not really something that has made its way to standard German. All of the ones that I have circled here are changes that are weaker or not present in standard German as opposed to really high Upper German. In standard German you have an aspirated k. So it is quite similar in the sense that you have the velar stop k, and then you have an aspiration on the release of that, but it happens at a different place in the mouth. In standard German, the Kind is a little further back in the mouth and is not quite as strongly pronounced as with Kind. The third step here is where voiced stops become voiceless. Here we have Ribbe becomes Rippe. This is the rib bone, stays this way in English. You have middle in English, becomes Mittel. And then Brugge, this becomes bridge later in English, but remains quite similar in Dutch, becomes Brücke. This is spelled with a CK in modern standard German. Then still in High German, we have voiced affricates becoming voiced stops. In general, voiced affricates disappeared in all Germanic languages. This beta, so a Greek B, this is like an F but voiced. So you make it with your lips and it is voiced. V. So originally a half would be halv. And these have disappeared in all Germanic languages, but they have developed in different directions. So in English, this has become devoiced and has become half. And in High German, it has stayed voiced, but has become a stop. So you get halbe. The same is again the case at the alveolar ridge. So you get from brother, you get brother. In English, this has become brother, devoiced. And at the velum, gestern becomes yesterday in English and gestern in modern German. Then we have the palatalization of SK, skiff, becomes schiff. This is already the form of this word in modern Standard German, and this is the same process that has happened in English as well. Skip has become ship in English. And then a couple of changes that explain a lot of differences between English and High German vocabulary. So you have T, alveolar stop after a vowel becomes Z, the voiced sibilant, and syllable initial aspirants disappear. So what becomes what for a while, in the same way as in English, but then quickly the what becomes was. You might notice that still at this point these are strongly labial wa, so similar to what you might encounter in modern English. And this, particularly this post-vocalic change, is something that occurs in a huge amount of words. For example, water, Water becomes Wasser. And looking through or listening to German, you will find a huge amount of words that have been affected by this. After this, or even during this, you start getting this divide into Central and Upper German. We also have a map of this. So the Upper German, which we will further get into, in general has more of these changes, and Central German has some but not all. So again, you might hear Apfelkuchen, for example, in Saxony or in the Rhineland. Frankfurt, for example, is in the traditional Central German language area, but because Standard German is more of an Upper German variety, it has taken hold outside the historical Upper German language area as well. For example, very few people in northern Germany speak Low German, a kind of North Sea Germanic language. Maybe 100,000 people out of tens of millions of people living in this area. So what kind of sound changes do we have in medieval German, Middle High German? This is the kind of this is the step where German becomes recognizable if you speak modern German. For example, we have the devoicing of word final stops. Here we have Tag becomes Tag. You might still hear people saying Tag, Guten Tag, or you might hear this lenitioned into Guten Tag, depending on where you are. Day was originally Dag, and you can see that again in English it has developed in a different way. The D has survived, but the G has disappeared. Whereas in High German the G survived and the D became a T. You also have a lot of reductions of unstressed vowels, again very similarly to English. For example, here the plural of days, so you would have several Tage in early High German, but in Middle High German you have several Tage. And in some cases the vowel ends up disappearing entirely. In the example of Fraue, the W disappears entirely and becomes only Frau. You can hear Fraue in some Dutch dialects, even to this day. And then finally we have a similar vowel process as the Great Vowel Shift in English, where in the case of German, long vowels and diphthongs that begin in the top part of the mouth become dramatically changed and get the values that they have in modern Standard German. For example, for time, Zeit, this becomes Zeit, which is again the pronunciation in modern German. And you might notice as well that Zeit in English also has the I, but is written with an E. This is because this similar process happened much later in English. And in English, the spelling reflects an earlier stage of the language. So if you read English as it is written, you end up with English of perhaps 1300, late medieval. In the case of German, this is often the same case, but in English this change had happened before that, so it is reflected in the writing. I will jump to the right. E is at the front, U is also at the front, U is at the back, because here Hus for house becomes house. This is easier to explain first. And then for the plural, we had Hus. This had gained a weak reduced vowel again. We had Hüser, and this becomes Häuser, which is again the current pronunciation in English. House is also pronounced exactly the same in English, but is spelled differently. When it comes to the old diphthongs, these become monophthongs. So where you used to move from, for example, in ear, the tongue starts at the front, top of the mouth and moves towards the middle. In this case, it just stays at the top and front. So you have a sort of reversal, rotation of these sounds, that old long monophthongs become diphthongs and the old diphthongs become long monophthongs. Again, leading into the current values of these sounds. For example, vier, four, becomes vier. Again, modern German. Grüne becomes grüne. Again, modern German. And gut becomes gut. Again, modern German. Then getting into New High German. This is something that this is the stage of development after the last time that German spelling has been majorly reformed. So here we start seeing things that are not necessarily reflected in the writing of standard German. One of these is a systematization of sibilants. So before this, you might have different sibilants, so S-like sounds all around words, but afterwards they become strictly segregated. So you only before vowels you only have the voiced sibilant. At the start of a word, before other consonants, you only have the hushed sibilant, and otherwise you only have the unvoiced sibilant. Some of these change words, so see, for example, see, or lake becomes see. This is how it is pronounced in modern German, but it is still written as S-E-E. And Stein was originally Stein. For example, if you speak Norwegian, you might have heard Steinar for stones. This becomes Stein in modern German. In this case, it is written with E-E instead of A-E. Stone. And das stays as das. Das is also an example of some of the earliest High German shifts, and it is cognate, so it comes from the same origin as the word that. Then we have labial fricatives developing into different ones. So the W w moves slightly back in the mouth instead of using both lips, which is what bilabial means. It either becomes labiodental, so you use a lip and some teeth, or it merges into something else. So instead of ewig, ewig, you get ewig, w, v, ewig, ewig. This is eternal. And then you have eyebrow, brower becomes brower. So it turns from a bilabial approximant semivowel, it turns into a front vowel. A slight difference, but enough to be noticed, even still. This is actually a process that might have its origins in material culture. I don't have the archaeological or anatomical expertise to entirely critically look at this idea, but it might be that when people started eating with forks and knives instead of using their teeth to cut things apart, the anatomy of the human mouth seems to have changed a little bit. I know that it is correct that for medieval skeletons we have something like this. You have the tongue here, this is the alveolar ridge, and the lips, and the teeth. And in medieval and older skeletons, the teeth meet each other. This is usually today not the case. Usually, in modern humans, the teeth overlap slightly. And this is something that seems to appear around the time that we stopped eating like cavemen, and is the case in Europe as well as in Eastern Asia, when chopsticks came to be widely used. And if this difference, so this is the anatomical difference is something that we know happened. It seems quite likely that it did indeed happen because of the changes in culinary culture, and it is possible that this is why the bilabial semivowels disappear in a lot of languages. This is also the case in Romance languages. For example, Latin still had a w, not quite the same as in English. Sometimes you see English teachers, so Latin teachers that are English speaking, teaching their students to pronounce the Latin v, as it is written with a V, as an English w. This is not quite correct. The Latin w was an approximant, so it is not quite as strongly pronounced as the English w. So, for example, Victor for winner, saying it Victor, like for example modern Italians would, is not quite correct. But saying Victor, like modern English, is also not quite correct. What you want is something sort of in the middle. So Victor, for example. So then, getting back to the slides, we have some disappearing aspirants. In this case, syllable medial. Though this is word medial. Of course, aspirants cannot be in the middle of syllables. So we have sehen, to see. In a previous stage of development, turns into ze, with the sibilant systematization, and the aspirant h disappears. So you get sehen. Again, this is how it is pronounced in modern standard German. After this, we start getting into the various Upper German variants. There are three main branches. One is Bavarian or Austro-Bavarian, one is Alemannic, and one is Franconian. Franconian is the one that we will be following, mostly because no, actually, let's get to the map already. Nuremberg is here in the Franconian language area, and Nuremberg was a cultural center during the German Renaissance. It was a huge hub of the printing press in Germany, and as a result of this, a huge amount of early German printed books were printed in Franconian Upper German. This is effectively the reason that Standard German is quite close to Franconian. But, of course, as is the case in English and French as well, the standard language is a development of the past, and the Franconian language has developed further since the development of the printing press and the standardization of German. If you want to find people who actually speak standard German, you are actually most likely to find them in northern Germany, where the native Low German language has almost been eliminated. And that is exactly why, as the local language has been eliminated in favor of Standard German, the locals actually had to learn Standard German. This was not quite the case in southern Germany. So, an Aleman or a Bavarian would be able to read Standard German without problem and did not have to learn it as a new language. And as a result of this, the southern German languages have been able to diverge from the kind of historical Upper German that Standard German exemplifies, without having to be replaced entirely. So we have the Aleman languages in southwestern Germany and Switzerland. We have the Austro-Bavarian languages in most of Bavaria and Austria, and a bit of Italy here. And we have the Franconian languages in northern Bavaria and a bit of some of the other German states. And what has happened in Franconian after the Renaissance period? Some of these have happened in other Upper German variants as well. So, if you meet or know or are, for example, Swiss or Austrian, you might identify some of these as something that you say yourself, even though you are not Franconian. Again, we have the area of pronunciation stays the same, but the method of articulation changes. For example, here, unvoiced stops become voiced. So Apfel, apple in Standard German, becomes Äpfel. All of these words here also display the end result of the reduction of the unvoiced, of the unstressed vowel. So once it has become V in the middle of the mouth, afterwards it just disappears, and the second syllable gains a syllabic consonant. There are some of these in English as well. For example, you might hear people say button with or button, where the n is the only element in the second syllable. This kind of syllabic consonants were possible in Proto-Indo-European. They all disappeared, but they have reappeared in some Indo-European languages, such as the Germanic languages and also the Slavic languages. There is, for example, an island called Krk in Croatia, and the Czech for wolf is vlk. And here with Upper German, you have Übfel, where the L is a syllable on its own. At the alveolar ridge, we have viertel, 1/4, becomes verdel, verdel. Somewhat difficult for me to pronounce. And then at the velum, deckel, this is the covering of a pot, for example, a lid, becomes deggel. We have gl as the entire second syllable. And then, opposite of this, voiced stops. If they are between vowels, become come again. I have written unvoiced fricatives, but all of these are actually voiced fricatives. I've made a bit of a mistake here. And here we would like to have the. So, again, at the lips, you have Gabel. This is a fork in Standard German, and this becomes Gaffel in Franconian. This might begin to remind you of Arnold Schwarzenegger, the famous bodybuilder and actor. An Austrian himself, so not a Franconian speaker, but an Upper German speaker. Funnily enough, I find that Mr. Schwarzenegger sounds exactly the same when he is speaking German as he does when he is speaking English. There are some people who somehow have a different accent, let's say, when speaking different languages. I have a friend who sounds very different when speaking English than she does speaking German. But in the case of Mr. Schwarzenegger, this is not the case. He just always sounds like that. And again, at the alveolar ridge, we have Zeiten, times, which becomes Zeiten. It is again difficult for me. Voiced fricatives in general are something that my own language does not have, so producing them is difficult for me. But when we have that combined with syllabic consonants, it becomes almost unbearable. Then at the velum, we have Vogel, so bird, which becomes Vogel. Again, difficult for me. And finally, of course, these are not all the changes that have occurred in Franconian, but this is the final that I present to you. We have a loss of palatal and velar fricatives. These two are allophones in German, so it means that they are pronounced at different parts of the mouth, but they act both for linguistic processes like this, and to a large degree in the imagination of the people speaking them, as if they were the same sound. So if you were to ask Germans on the street if they notice that the ch in endlich and ich are different, they probably would not, unless they have specifically been educated in this. The ich, this has developed from an ik, and it's pronounced at the velum like k, ch, whereas this c with a tail is pronounced at the palate, so the forward part of the roof of the mouth. Endlich, not endlich. And these become, here we have the unvoiced to voiced, and the loss of the fricative. So we have endlich, and then e as I. And the loss of the consonant in ik is something that has also appeared in English. This is something that the spelling has been changed for since the times of Geoffrey Chaucer. Around 1300, the English for I was still ich, where ich had become ich, and then ich became e, and e became I. The reason that it is not I in, or ich, in Standard German is because the E was not long at that time. It was ich, not ich. If it were ich, it would have become I. So, that is the end of this presentation. Let's move back to Middle High German again for a moment, because I like to trail this over and over. Usually when you read a modern European language, for many of these languages, the way that it is written is close to the way that the language was pronounced in the late Middle Ages. This was the case for English, this was the case for French, this is the case for German. In the case of German, the difference between late medieval High German and modern Standard High German is smaller than it was for the other two languages. But there is still a bit of a difference. And this will also be the case in 2 weeks in the episode for Spanish. If you have wondered why there are words in Spanish that are written with a Z or a C, when both are pronounced th or s, if you are Andalusian or Latin American, that is also because these things were pronounced differently in the late Middle Ages. But that is something that we will get to in 2 weeks. Thank you for coming. I imagine that in the history of these episodes there will be fairly few questions, so thank you for coming. La missa è finita. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. And if you have comments or questions, please feel free to write them in. I will stop the recording for YouTube. Have a good evening, later viewers on YouTube.